Welcome to Goldfish on Games. When we last looked at this machine, the Atari 600XL, we'd cleaned it up, we'd fixed up most of its major issues, and we took a quick skim across what it could do. But it's time to take a deeper dive at its software and take a look at a few of the upgrades that can make using it so much more nicer. So where else can we start but with the basics? Atari Basic, that is, which, as I previously mentioned, was integrated directly onto the motherboard in the XL line, and will auto boot when you start the machine. This is the second revision of Atari Basic, which fixed a few minor bugs, but in doing so introduced some pretty major ones. Later 800XL and XE models got a third revision which mostly fixed these, but the 600 users are either stuck with an older version or have to replace the ROM chips. When Atari decided they wanted to make a computer, they knew they needed BASIC, but they were very limited in the amount of space they could have for the actual ROM, as it had to fit on an 8KB cart that they were producing at the time. After working hard to try and make off-the-shelf versions of BASIC fit in such a small space, they gave up and decided to start something from scratch, which in doing so allowed them to make some quality of life improvements, like detecting errors when you entered the line, or having commands that worked directly with the hardware. However, not everything was an improvement. It was actually one of the slower implementations of its time, despite the fact it actually had one of the faster processors going. There were various reasons for this, including an expensive way of handling numbers, to a particularly slow way how jumps were performed for go subs and for loops, which actually got worse as the size of the program grew. This resulted in some third parties actually releasing their own upgrade carts to fix some of these issues, but thankfully it's just about fast enough for the program that I'm writing. Now, it's not going to win any awards for its graphics or sound, but I want to save it anyway, and by default you could only save to the cassette drive. If you wanted to save to the floppy disk, you had to make sure there was a disk in the drive that actually had Atari DOS already installed on it. That would then load in the drive as required, which unsurprisingly required a bit more RAM. But thankfully I've already got one loaded, and I can save my program by typing save quotes D1, which is the drive, colon, and then its name, which in this instance will be gfg.bas. Yep, it's using the classic 8.3 file name convention here. And then if you want to have a look at what's on the disk, you can type in DOS to bring up its main menu. And here we can do all the typical things such as listing directories, renaming files, copying them, but when we want to go back to BASIC, we just have to select Run Cartridge, which on the classic machines would have run the right hand cart slot. DOS isn't the only command that can get built in. We can also ask BASIC to go bye bye, and doing that we end up at the system menu, which allows us to boot directly from cassette or floppy disk games, as well as gives us a self-test system, which we can use to test memory, which is quite slow, the graphics and the sound, which we've seen in the previous episode, as well as the keyboard. It's a very nice feature to have, as it really helped when checking out the machine while we were restoring it. And this memory test is actually a reminder that we only have 16KB of RAM, so let's look at trying to fix that, shall we? As it's actually possible to mod the machine so it has the same amount of RAM as the 800XL. And here we have the motherboard out again, and the plan is to replace the two 16KB RAM chips with their 64KB equivalents. And the set I have here were actually bought as replacements for the ZX Spectrum 128, but these puppies are destined for an Atari. But just switching out the RAM chips isn't enough. We're gonna have to also solder a few patch cables. First one from the resistor here to this pin, and then from this pin to this pad, and finally from this pin to that pad. Now, my soldering skills are pretty basic and quite shocking, so I'm not going to subject you to that horror. So instead, here's the board upgraded. So I've lifted the resistor out of the board and raised pin 8 on this chip, and then soldered a wire between the two of them and added a bit of heat shrink. I then lifted pin 10 from this chip and soldered it directly to this pad. And finally, I lifted pin 3 of this chip and soldered it to the pad next to the first one. Now, this was a little tricky, so let's see if it worked. Well, the machine boots, which is always a good thing, so let's do a quick test in BASIC to see how our free memory looks, and yep, that's actually looking pretty good. So let's try a memory test. If this works, it should show 3 lines of dots. So let's sit through the whole thing. Just kidding, let's speed this sucker up. And it worked! Oh yeah. You know what this means? It's time to test some games. So Universal Hero was one of the games we tried to play last time and it failed to boot then. So let's try it now and see how it goes. Oh man, look at that, it loaded. And I'm in the game and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. It took well over 10 minutes to load and I'm already stuck. This is the classic gaming that I remember. Weirdly, I do actually miss the loading bars from machines like the ZX Spectrum and the CPC, as it did give you a really good idea that something was actually happening. Because a few times when I was trying to load this game, I wasn't sure if it was actually working or not. You could hear the loading sounds, but nothing was showing on screen, until it started to randomly change the colours, which more seems to be a burn-in protection for your screen than actually showing the game is loading. And that actually confused me a couple of times. And with that in mind, I decided to see if there was a more modern and faster solution to loading games. And what I came across was this, the S-Drive Max. An all-in-one solution for loading games from an SD card designed by KBR. It's not the only drive emulator for the Atari, but it was reasonably priced and I liked the idea it had a nice big screen for when you worked with it, though I have no idea if the touchscreen will actually make it easier to use or not, but that, coupled with the fact that it came with a case that was stylized on the machine itself, was a bonus to me. To use the device, you should copy the bootloader program to the SD card, and whatever games you might want to try out. And then by holding down the options key while booting, it will give you the on-screen selector, and give you a really nice menu for working with the device itself. From here we can insert a disc into any of the 3 floppy drives that it emulates, or even load a cassette game. You can select these either via the device or via the on-screen loaded application. And when you select a game via the application, it actually updates the screen on the device, though it doesn't do it in reverse unfortunately. So let's try loading up one of the games I already own, Feud, and give it a go with this device, and see how much faster it would load. Now I know it's not going to be instantaneous, like cartridges, but it should still be a hell of a lot faster than the 10 odd minutes that it took to load off a cassette. I'm hoping it should be around about 30-40 seconds at most, but let's see how it goes. And it at least sounds like it's loading a lot faster. Those notes are much quicker than it was before. Oh, and boy, that loads quite quickly. As with Universal Hero, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, but it looks pretty nice and it sounds really good as well, to be honest. That's really making a great use of the Pokey chip. This device will certainly make using the Atari so much nicer, and it'll actually give me a chance to try out some of the higher rated games on the system. And after checking a number of online sources, these are the games that seem to come up more often than not. So let's see how good they actually are. And in no particular order, let's start with one of the other games that I picked up, Revenge of the Mutant Camels by Jeff Minter. And being a Jeff Minter game, it's suitably insane. It's a side-scrolling shooter where you control of all things a camel who can fire bullets out of his head, and you have to take out various weird and wonderful things along the way. But thankfully you can upgrade your camel. Yep, that's right, you can upgrade the camel. This includes larger bullets and better shields. Between a cool looking floor as well as a lot of sprites going on the screen, it's quite a nice looking game, if one that doesn't sound all that impressive. Next up is Rainbow Walker, a game I was a bit unsure of at first, as the controls are a little bit fiddly and a little bit slippery. But once I got into the swing of it, the game really did grow on me. The goal is to colour all the squares on the randomly generated grid by moving across them, but you're hindered in this by baddies that will reset the squares, and creatures that will pick you up and move you across the map. I really dig the perspective that they've given the levels, It's a really interesting effect, and it gives the game a very unique style. Though it does mean that you have to be careful when you're near the bottom of the screen, as it doesn't scroll until you're quite close, which means travelling down at speed is a dangerous thing to do. This game is one that I feel I'm going to return to again, as it is quite fun. Following that up, we have Miner 2049, which has a very similar core game mechanic as the last game, in which you have to touch all the platforms to change their colour, but this is done in a more platformer fashion, and is very reminiscent of games like Donkey Kong. Jumping is very important, as you can take out the wandering bad guys by jumping at the right time, or just jump over to avoid them. You also need to jump on floating platforms, but be careful, as if you miss you're going to fall and die. While it doesn't look as impressive as some of the games in this video, it is still a lot of fun to play. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have Lucasfilm Games, who really like to show off what the Atari could do, and this is plain to see in Rescue on Fractalus. From the incredibly cool looking intro, then the really nicely done animated sequence when you launch, to be an in-game with its full 3D flight sim. It is just stunning to see. You fly around these fractal canyons, taking out aircraft and gun emplacements while rescuing downed pilots. After playing it for a bit, I'm still a bit hazy on how you fully play this game, so I'm going to have to come back to it after I've read the manual. But damn, it's an impressive game to see in action. Finally, we have the game that I've actually put the most time into, Yomp. Just from the loading screen and the main menu, you can tell this is a very polished game, and it just looks stunning in motion. And thankfully, it has a simple pick up and play gameplay that makes it just absolutely fun. The goal is simple: make it to the end of the tunnel. To do that, you're going to have to travel around the tube as well as jump over holes, which can either be triggered by the player or by the jump squares. There's also other squares that will give you points, speed the game up or down, as well as give you extra lives. Amazingly, this is the newest game on the list, as it actually came out in 2007, and is free to download from the developer's website. There'll be a link in the description. Wow, we really covered a lot of ground in this video. So much so in fact that if there's any part that you'd like me to go into in more detail, or if you know of any games that you think I might really enjoy, leave me a message here in the comments or find me on Twitter or Discord, as any excuse to mess around with this machine more is greatly appreciated, as I've had so much fun with it so far. And until next time, I've been the Goldfish, that was one hell of a machine, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thank you for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing or checking out some of my other videos, which you can find links to on the screen right now.